Welcome back to another episode of the Engineering Future Podcast. I have Neil Thompson here with me. He's an engineer that has an amazing podcast about all about public speaking and doing communicating in the virtual space. Neil, do you want to just give us a quick overview of what you do and some of the things you do with your podcast?
Sure. Well, I founded Teach the Geek because of my own struggles when it comes to public speaking. I used to work as an engineer and I had to give presentations on a monthly basis in front of senior management. And those first few presentations were absolutely horrendous. I didn't know it was possible to sweat that profusely from one's body. But there I was, doing exactly that. And wouldn't you know that when I sat in on some of the other engineers' presentations, they weren't all that much better at it than I was. But I think the biggest issue I think a lot of us had is we have all this technical expertise, but we're not the best at putting it in such a way that non-technical people can understand. So I got a lot better at it over time because I didn't want to keep looking like a moron in front of all of these senior management types, and I basically built out a course, an online course geared towards people like myself, engineers and scientists, people in the STEM fields, and I called it Teach the Geek to Speak. And so that's where it all started with that course. And then it eventually became or evolved into a membership. And then I also have, as you mentioned, the podcast, Teach the Geek podcast. And I talk to engineers and scientists mostly, and people in the STEM fields again, about their journeys in public speaking and then also their career journeys. When I first started the podcast, I really wanted to know more, of course, about public speaking since that's what I'm about and that's what Teach the Geeks about. But it's been really interesting to learn people's career journeys too. In fact, one of my more recent guests, and this is a guest I'll probably remember for quite some time. I actually even wrote a post about it on LinkedIn last week. This is a woman who got a degree in civil engineering, never worked as a civil engineer. Then she went to law school, worked as a lawyer for a few years. Then she was a stay-at-home mom for about a decade, and now she works as a personal stylist. That's just a average career trajectory, wouldn't you say? Well, not
Yeah.
not really. It's so interesting to see where someone starts and then where they end up. And just because
Mhm.
you start off somewhere doesn't mean that's where you have to end up. You know, it's your life. You make it as you will. And so that's another reason I like doing the podcast, just hearing interesting stories from interesting people.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I just want to start the conversation basically right there where you were left it off. Why do engineers or like people in STEM that are very technical fields, why do we need to learn how to be public speakers and like why is it so important for us to communicate better with others?
Because you don't want to be that engineer sitting in your cubicle mad because someone else got the promotion and pay raise you thought you deserved. But because they were better at just communicating their value to the company, they got that promotion, they got that pay raise. So it's in the engineer's best interest to get better at communicating with others, especially decision makers who tend to be those higher up type people and also non-technical people.
Yeah, and I think one of the traits that I've seen great leaders and obviously great engineers, owners of companies, is just they're well spoken and they have really good communication skills, and that encompass just written skills, are very concise with everything they do. They speak really easily when they have trying to communicate a design or even within the company. So I think definitely public speaking is a really important skill. We touched about this in previous episodes as well. But what are some of the challenges that you've seen uh, engineers, especially early on, young engineers trying to get their first job and trying to just succeed and understand all these new changes in terms of public speaking, understanding what are the best ways to prepare to be good speakers, as well as just communication in general.
I think it has to do with thinking of their technical skills is enough, and
Mhm.
it's not. As I mentioned, if you want to move up within an organization, you can't be the person that's just technically proficient. You have to be someone who's able to communicate how important that those technical skills are to the people who have the decisions to impact your career. So younger engineers coming into the industry, that's something that they really should take to heart. And a great way to improve your speaking skills is to find opportunities within your company to do it. You know, I think a lot of the times we as engineers tend to shy away from those opportunities because they make us uncomfortable. But growth comes from discomfort. So I highly encourage people to embrace the uncomfortable. So look for opportunities within your company. Is there opportunities to talk about what you're working on? Do you work in a team? And if so, practice within your team. I mean, I worked as a project lead. Perhaps look for to get a job as a project lead at your company, so you do get have the opportunity to present in front of these senior management or management types. There's all kinds of ways. Even Toastmasters, if you
Mhm.
want to go outside the company, it's a national or international organization that is a great opportunity to practice your speaking skills in front of others. And more than likely, the people you're going to be practicing in front of are not technical. And so if you're able to make what you're talking about understandable to them, then it's you're much more likely to be able to do so in front of non-technical management types.
Yeah, and I've done Toastmasters in the past, and I think it's a scary place to be as an engineer, just because you're kind of learning these new skills of communicating. You're getting judged by others, or I mean, positive judgment in terms of like your communication style, how many ums and ahs and all of those things you say. So you become more aware of these little things that when you're speaking, maybe you're nervous in front of a crowd, you don't really pick up as easily. And so in terms of finding accountability, I think Toastmasters is a great place. I also found that just communicating within the team is a little easier when you have that connection. You work with them every single day. Having things like a podcast, a YouTube channel, something where you're practicing speaking, you have to write a script, and you present it to a camera, or even with your spouse, your friend, whatever. Just in terms of just practicing and getting consistent and doing it every day, I think it's one of the things that has benefited me a lot, especially coming from a different background, English not being my first language, and always just trying to think and not say so many filler words when I'm trying to communicate. So practice obviously is the best way to really learn how to speak and feel more confident. And the best way to do it as well is just going to conferences, networking, as well as just giving presentations at conferences where you either give a take-up presentation on paper, or are simply there to just network with other people. Something we talked about here in the past, you and I, when I was on your podcast, was the presentations that engineers give when they're trying to present a research paper, a design, something that needs to be transmitted to someone else. And we were talking about how really boring some of these presentations are when they just read from a PowerPoint slide, and that's all they do. I want to hear from you on what do you think makes a good presentation, and how we can change the view of I just need to put everything in words in a PowerPoint slide and just read it when I'm trying to present to someone.
Well, if the goal of a presentation is to get people to listen, you have to engage them first. And you're not going to engage them if you're just reading from slides because you're not even looking at them. I mean, when typically even if you're not giving a presentation, you're just talking to somebody on the street. You're more likely going to listen to them if they're looking at you and you're looking at them, as opposed to if they're looking down and you're looking away, or you're not looking at each other. The conversation or the communication might be misinterpreted. So I'm a big fan of engagement, and a great way to do that is to make sure that you have minimal text on your slides, so you're not tempted to read the slides because there's not a whole lot of words to read. Now you're forced to actually talk to the people that are in the audience, and not only that, the people in the audience then don't have the option of reading the slides because it's difficult to read and listen to somebody at the same time. And we can read a lot, we can read very, very quickly, but if the words are up there, we might just continue to read them as opposed to listening to what the person has to say. I'm a big fan of minimizing the words because you eliminate that option. So now either they're going to listen to you or they're going to ignore you. So now it's a 1 in 2 chance of them listening as opposed to a 1 in 3. And I like those odds better.
Do you have any examples of presentations that just have really stuck to you over the years, and what really impacted you from those presentations?
Well, actually, I listened, or yeah, I watched a few of them yesterday. So earlier this month, I became an adjunct instructor for the engineering management program at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and so I'm teaching this class in communications, leadership, and management. And they had to do a presentation on a case studies. There's 6 groups, and I'd say maybe half of them really knocked it out the park with their presentations. They had minimal words on the page, and they had mostly images. And when you speak to images, I think it's a lot better than just speaking to just words, because now there's nothing to read. You actually have to talk about the image, and people an image tells us out 1,000 words anyway. So you're still getting the words in there. It's just not on the screen. They're more in your words that you're actually saying. And so as I mentioned, I'm a big fan of using minimal words and then having images as opposed to the words, so the people can actually listen as opposed to read.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I also seen just from different presentations at different conferences. Is just having images, and not only images, but a lot of times images that represent something like a concept or something you're trying to transmit to the audience, and you do it in a way that is not directly showing a like an example that comes to mind. They were talking about fillets. Is not really showing a fillet in the page. They're showing that the top, like the fillet of the shark, and explaining that, and then making the analogy to what they're actually trying to talk about in terms of the technical concept. And that image just kind of stuck to me. And this was like 2 years ago. So I think things like that make this presentation a little more effective, as well as give you like a different perspective in terms of not only focusing on the technical information, but creating those analogies and comparisons that really stick to people's mind. And I think that kind of also makes a great way to transmit the information and make like a memorable presentation. What are some of the challenges that you have seen for engineers in general when they're trying to prepare for these presentations? And a lot of times, obviously, as engineers, a lot of us are introverts and don't like to speak publicly, and so we don't really enjoy giving this presentation in the first place. But we both know, and it's very well known that we need to be better communicators to transmit the design and share what we're learning and all the knowledge. So, what are some of the challenges that we have faced as engineers, and how can we prepare better for giving these presentations?
Well, I think we fake ourselves out by saying because we're introverts, that means we're not going to be the best of public speakers. I mean, all introversion is that when you interact with others, you just need some downtime afterwards to recharge and get your energy back. But that doesn't mean that you can't get on a stage and present in front of people. So I think we really need to change our mindset when it comes to just being introverts in general. Just because we're introverts doesn't mean that public speaking has to be something that is something to avoid. So that's something that I think would really help us.
And what about maybe some strategies that you teach in your course and you've seen throughout the years in terms of just really preparing to give these presentations? I read a few books on just communication, as well as kind of influencing people and making people kind of be attracted to you and the way you communicate. What are some of those strategies that you have seen work for engineers when they're trying to give this information?
Well, once you get over the fact that because you're an introvert, then public speaking is something you can get better at, I'm a big fan of visualizing success. So before you
Mhm.
give a presentation, you actually look. I suggest closing your eyes and actually visualizing the way you want the presentation to go. I mean, if you tell yourself that you're going to wet the bed at the presentation, you probably will. So you don't tell yourself that. You visualize things going the way you want them to go. You know what you're going to talk about. You speak about it in the way that you practiced. Afterwards, you get questions that you know the answers to, and even if you don't know the answer to them, you're confident enough to say that you don't know the answer, but you can look into it and get the answer. At least that applies when you're talking to people within a company. That possibly doesn't apply when you're talking to a more general audience that you won't see again. But
Mhm.
essentially, you visualize the things that the way that you want them to go. I think is really helpful. And then not only that, but when you're practicing, I'm a big fan of practicing to time. I've been to so many conferences where the whole agenda gets thrown off because people go over their allotted time. So when you're practicing, practice to the time that you've been given. So for instance, if you have 15 minutes to give a presentation, don't practice it so that you finish in 15 minutes. Practice it so you finish within 14. So now you have a 1 minute buffer in the event that you say something that you didn't plan on saying on the day of the presentation. And
Mhm.
even if that happens, you still have that 1 minute to play with, that so that you don't go over that 15-minute time.
Yeah, I think that's some great advice, and a lot of this presentation, obviously, when you don't prepare and don't know what you're presenting in terms of the outline and information in technical concepts, you get caught up because you know the topic so well that you can just ramble for a long time without really realizing you're 5-10 minutes over the time that you were allotted to, and then the presentation after that gets late and so on. So I think that that's a great advice as well. And in terms of just giving these presentations, I found that again preparing is key, especially for engineers that may not like public speaking, that don't feel comfortable when you're up in the stage. Just preparing and knowing your topic really well, that'll give you that confidence of, even if you're nervous, you know the topic so well, there's going to be easy to find the words to just transmit the information and give it to other people, which I think it's basically the whole point of public speaking and communication in general. Now let's talk about some of the benefits of public speaking and communication in general for engineers. So what are some of those benefits that you found in terms of getting maybe a higher position within the company, just being more influential in the field, or just other benefits that we have seen for engineers?
So it can very well start off with getting that job in the first place. To get a job, you typically have to go through an interview, and
Mhm.
if that's the case, then it certainly being a better communicator would help in just being able to communicate your potential value to a company, to the people that you're interviewing with. And then once you get the job, now you have to communicate value all over again to the people that you're working with. And working as a product development engineer, as I did, I often wanted to get other ideas that perhaps I had for the company to potentially put money into. So now you need to convince people, these decision makers who I mentioned oftentimes are not technical, that they should put money and
Mhm.
resources behind putting this idea into fruition. So it starts right from the beginning when you're looking for the job, all the way up until you're well into your career, or working in various jobs. Do you have the ability to communicate? Do you have the ability to influence and persuade people that whatever you want to work on is something to work on, or even that you need other resources to get the work that you've already been assigned done? I mean, there really is there's no downside to becoming a better communicator. And then also, it's moving up within organizations. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, you don't want to be that engineer that's always disgruntled because someone else got the position. They were better connected. They were the ones that were communicating with decision makers. That's why they got the promotion, not because they were necessarily the most technically skilled. And no, not even that, but when you move up into, for instance, a management position, a manager of people, now you really need to be an exemplary communicator, because you got to communicate with the team, the people that are reporting to you. You can have all the technical skills in the world, but you're not a technical worker anymore. Now you're a manager of people.
Mhm.
That's a completely different skill set altogether. And one of the skills that you really should hone when you have that type of job is communicating with others.
Yeah, I think that's completely true, and I've seen this over my short career. And when I speak to owners of companies and coworkers and everything, I think one of the things that they mention about my career as well as other coworkers is the fact that the better we communicate with each other, the easier it's going to be to make these projects successful, as well as make clients happy. And communication is kind of the base of all of these things that we want to do in our careers. What are some books that you have found really useful in your career in terms of public speaking, communicating better, learning the skills to give a speech in front of a crowd?
Well, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I wrote one. It's a fairly short read, and it's called Teach the Geeks to Speak. And I made it a fairly short read because I know engineers are busy and want things that are direct and to the point. I found that a lot of books that I read, not just necessarily on public speaking, but just on personal development or professional development in general, are unnecessarily long. And then I thought maybe I'm the only person who thinks this. So sometimes I go to Amazon and I go to the book reviews, and I look at the 1 and 2 star reviews. I never look at the 4 and 5 because I'm really interested to see what people dislike about books. And a common dislike is that books are unnecessarily long. There's too much unnecessary information in there. There's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of fluff. So I tried to make sure that the book that I wrote was direct and to the point. Essentially the things that I think are important in becoming a more effective public speaker.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially for engineers that are again busy, are trying to get the information and apply it instantly. What are some of those maybe one or two key takeaways from your book for engineers to start applying these concepts and just become better speakers immediately?
You mentioned it earlier that when you give presentations when you were in Toastmasters, you mentioned filler words. I mentioned filler words in the book too. A lot of ums, ahs, you knows. When you're in Toastmasters, that gets drilled into you because they mention in the meeting how many you knows, how many so's, how
Hmm.
many likes you use, and oftentimes it's way more than perhaps you even thought you used. So I'm a big fan of trying to minimize those filler words, and a great way to do that is to video or at least have audio of you presenting. And by doing that, you can at least go back and listen, and you can actually count for yourself the number of ahs, you know, so's, and likes that you use in your presentation. It's so helpful in minimizing those words. I was talking to someone fairly recently, and they actually asked me, are filler words even that big a deal? And I actually read an article that says that people who use filler words are conscientious. So for at least for some people, filler words are not an issue, but for some, they definitely are. One of those people is my mother. So as you mentioned, I have a podcast. And once my mother called me after watching one of my interviews, and she said that the guest that I had, she couldn't listen to the podcast after 5 minutes because of all the ums that he used during the presentation or during the interview. And that just made it crystal clear to me that minimizing filler words is probably the best route. You're not going to annoy the people who aren't bothered by them, but for people like my mother who are distracted by filler words, when you minimize them, they're more likely to listen too. So now you just increase the number of people who are listening, and I would think that'd be the point of you presenting.
Yeah, I think that's super true. And I mean, I record these episodes every week and edit them sometime, and I have to listen myself over and over, speak for I don't know thousands of hours at this point. So at the beginning, it was super clear that I was saying a lot of us, a lot of just filler words that are annoying when you're listening back to yourself, and you become just more conscious of when you're saying them, how you're saying them, and why you're using them. And also with time that kind of start reducing with the number of filler words, but I find myself still saying filler words even I think during this interview and every interview that I've done in the recent past. But it's a constant improvement of learning that these words are going to come up, taking the time to really think and construct the sentences, as well as just preventing just it's okay to take a pause for 1 2 seconds and kind of move on to the next point. It's okay to just be slow when you're speaking and having that calmness and just consciousness of when you're saying it. So thankfully for podcast there's editing, I'll be able to take a lot of those away when you before it comes out. But it's the fact that I'm listening to myself speak thousands of hours at this point and be conscious of these filler words are coming up. And I think that, well, I think that's a great point, because I think I become more conscious of that, as well as trying to reduce the filler words, which I think ultimately has hopefully made me a better speaker and a better communicator here on the podcast. So I really appreciate that. I think that's a great point. Do you have any final word of advice for engineers, students, or other people kind of listening to this that really want to get into public speaking or just communicating better in their job, with their partners, or anyone in their lives?
You don't get better at it unless you do it. So don't try to avoid it. Look for opportunities to practice in front of others, and don't aim for perfection. There's no such thing. Practice makes progress.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's true. And again, tons of hours here on the podcast. And if I go back to my first episode, it was horrible. I was not very concise, not very communicative in a way that was clear. And I've seen a lot of progress just from practicing. I recorded 60 70 interviews by this point, so that's tons of hours that I've been practicing and hopefully improving in all of this. So I just want to thank you for coming to the podcast, giving us all this advice. And then I just have one last question for you, and that's how can we continue engineering our future?
Well, when it comes to engineering our future, I think how we can continue to do that is seeing it as something that is attainable. I think for a
Mhm.
lot of people, they think that engineers is for somebody else, but it could very well be for you if you have that interest and you're willing to do the work. You may very well go into some environments and you may look around and think, I don't belong here. But you absolutely do because you're there. People hired you because they thought highly enough of you that they would offer you the position and you took it. So now that you're there, believe that you belong there and essentially move accordingly.
Yeah, that's a great advice. Again, thank you so much, Neil, for coming to the podcast, giving us all these great advice and resources to become better public speakers. Is a really important skill for communicating with others, for advancing our careers. And I'm very happy to have you here, just teaching us and giving us all that information that I think a lot of people are going to get a lot of value from. Where can people connect with you, reach out to you if they have any questions, or just simply just network with you?
Sure, they can find me at teachthegeek.com. And if you care to check out the podcast, you can go to youtube.teachthegeek.com.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming to the podcast, and I'll talk to you later.